Eleanor Whitmore had always believed that needles and thread could mend anything broken in this world. She learned this truth in her mother's sewing room in Boston, where silk ribbons danced in afternoon sunlight, and the gentle hum of the Singer sewing machine provided a steady rhythm to their quiet lives. Her delicate fingers could transform rough cotton into elegant gowns, and her eye for detail had earned her a reputation among the wealthy ladies of Beacon Hill. But life has a way of tearing apart even the most carefully stitched seams. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March 1882, delivered by a boy whose mud-caked boots left prints across her pristine shop floor. The words swam before her eyes as she read them once, twice, 3 times. Her father's business partner had disappeared overnight, taking with him not only the company funds but also the mortgage payments for her dress shop. The building would be seized within the month. Eleanor sat among the half-finished gowns hanging like ghosts in her workshop. 28 years old, unmarried, and now penniless. The ladies who once praised her skilled hands now whispered behind gloved fingers about her misfortune. In Boston society, scandal stuck to a woman like burr to wool. Impossible to remove. Her salvation came in the form of an advertisement in the Boston Herald. Cook wanted for cattle drive. Westward bound. Honest work for honest pay. Apply at Murphy's Supply Store. Eleanor had never cooked anything more complicated than tea and biscuits. But desperation had a way of making the impossible seem reasonable. Murphy's Supply Store smelled of leather, tobacco, and dreams deferred. The man behind the counter, Thomas Murphy, looked her up and down with the calculating gaze of someone who had seen plenty of folks running from their past. "You sure about this, miss? Trail cooking ain't like preparing tea for your church ladies. We're talking beans, hardtack, and whatever meat we can find along the way. 2 months on horseback, sleeping under stars, and dealing with 30 cowboys who haven't seen civilization in weeks." Eleanor straightened her shoulders. "I'm stronger than I appear, Mr. Murphy. And I learn quickly." Murphy studied her calloused fingertips, the result of years of needlework. "Well, those hands know hard work, I'll give you that. Trail boss is Jake Morrison. Fair man, but he don't tolerate nonsense. You'll meet the crew at dawn tomorrow by the river. Bring what you can carry and leave the rest behind." That night, Eleanor packed her life into a single leather satchel. She folded her finest dress, the midnight blue silk she had sewn for her own wedding that never happened. She included her sewing kit, wrapped carefully in an old apron, though she doubted she would find much use for embroidery on the frontier. Dawn broke gray and cold over the Charles River. Eleanor arrived to find a sea of horses, wagons, and men who looked as rough as the landscape they aimed to cross. The cattle, nearly 2,000 head of longhorns, waited restlessly in temporary pens. Their lowing filled the air with an almost musical quality that both thrilled and terrified her. Jake Morrison turned out to be a man in his 50s with kind eyes and hands that spoke of decades working with rope and leather. He welcomed Eleanor with the respectful nod of someone who understood that everyone had their reasons for heading west. "You'll be riding with the chuck wagon," he explained, gesturing toward a sturdy vehicle loaded with supplies. "Cookie here will teach you the basics, but he's getting too old for this work. By the time we reach Colorado, you'll need to handle meals on your own." Cookie, a grizzled man with a limp from an old injury, showed Eleanor the wagon's organization. Flour, beans, coffee, salt pork, and dried fruits had their designated places. Cast iron pots hung from hooks, and a water barrel secured to the side would be their lifeline across dry stretches. "Most important thing," Cookie wheezed, "is keeping the coffee hot and the biscuits coming. A hungry cowboy is a dangerous cowboy. Second most important thing is staying out of their way when they're working. These men live hard lives, and they don't all have proper manners around ladies." As the sun climbed higher, the cattle drive began its slow migration westward. Eleanor found herself swept into a rhythm older than civilization itself. The chuck wagon rolled along at the back of the herd, and she learned to time her cooking with the movement, preparing meals that could be served quickly when the cowboys rode in for their brief breaks. It was during the 3rd day that she first noticed him. He rode alone, always on the edges of the group, his black hat pulled low over eyes that seemed to see everything while revealing nothing. The other cowboys called him Nash, and when they spoke his name, Their voices carried a mixture of respect and wariness. Unlike the others who joked and shared stories around the evening fire, Nash ate his meals in silence and bedded down apart from the group. Eleanor observed him the way she once studied fabric patterns, noting details others missed. His horse, a magnificent black stallion, was better cared for than most men's children. His clothes, though dusty from the trail, had been expertly mended with stitches so small, and even they rivaled her own work. Someone had taught this man to sew, which raised questions that made her curious despite herself. On the fifth evening, as Eleanor struggled to get a fire started in the wind, Nash appeared beside her like a shadow. Without speaking, he knelt and arranged the kindling with practiced efficiency. In moments, flames were dancing cheerfully in the circle of stones. "Thank you," Eleanor said, but he was already walking away. Cookie, who had been watching from his bedroll, chuckled softly. "Don't take it personal, miss. Nash don't talk to nobody. Been with Morrison's outfit for 3 years now, and I doubt he's spoken 50 words total to any of us. Why is he so?" Eleanor searched for the right word. Careful? Could be lots of reasons. Some men come west to forget. Some come to hide. And some come because they got nowhere else to go. Nash strikes me as all three. As the days passed and the landscape changed from rolling green hills to endless prairie, Eleanor found herself unconsciously watching for Nash. He worked harder than any man she had ever seen, often riding from dawn until well past sunset. When the herd faced river crossings or difficult terrain, Nash was always where the danger was greatest, guiding cattle through treacherous paths with a skill that bordered on artistry. Yet he remained an island of solitude in the community of the trail. Eleanor's own transformation surprised her. Her hands, once soft from indoor work, grew strong from kneading dough and lifting cast-iron pots. Her skin bronzed from constant sun exposure, and her body adapted to the rhythm of horseback riding. She discovered she had a talent for trail cooking, creating meals that drew compliments even from the most hardened cowboys. "Miss Eleanor," said young Tommy Wells one evening as he accepted a plate of beans and cornbread, "my mama never made food this good. And she was famous in 3 counties for her cooking." The other men murmured their agreement, and Eleanor felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the campfire. For the first time in months, she was valued for her skills, rather than pitied for her circumstances. It was during the second week that trouble found them. Eleanor was gathering firewood when she heard shouting from the direction of the herd. She dropped her bundle and ran toward the commotion, arriving to see a dozen cattle missing and clear signs that rustlers had struck during the night watch. Morrison gathered the men around him, his jaw set with determination. "They got a head start, but we can track them. Nash, you and Williams take the north trail. Henderson and Martinez, check the south route. The rest of us will follow the main tracks." As the men prepared to ride out, Eleanor noticed Nash adjusting his gun belt, with movements that spoke of extensive practice. For the first time, she wondered about his past and what had taught him to handle weapons with such casual expertise. The tracking party returned at sunset with grim news. The rustlers were part of a larger gang that had been terrorizing cattle drives throughout the territory. They had superior numbers and knew the landscape better than Morrison's outfit. "We're going to have to change our route," Morrison announced. "Take the northern trail through the Badlands. It's harder country, but safer from rustlers." Nash spoke for the first time Eleanor had heard. "Northern trails got water problems. Springs are unreliable this time of year." His voice was deeper than she had expected, with an accent she couldn't place. Morrison nodded grimly. "You're right. But we don't have much choice. We'll have to be smart about water conservation." That night, as Eleanor cleaned the dinner pots by lamplight, Nash appeared at the edge of the firelight. He stood there for a long moment, and she had the impression he was struggling with something. Finally, he said, "You should know about the Northern Trail. It's hard country. Harder than anything you've faced so far." Eleanor looked up from her washing. "Are you suggesting I can't handle it?" Something that might have been amusement flickered in his dark eyes. "No, ma'am. I've seen you work. You're stronger than most men I know. I'm just saying, you should be prepared." He started to turn away, but Eleanor's voice stopped him. "Mr. Nash?" He paused without looking back. "Thank you for the warning. And for helping with the fires. You don't have to. But I appreciate it." For a moment, his shoulders seemed to relax slightly. "It's just Nash, and you're welcome." After he melted back into the darkness, Eleanor sat staring at the stars. There was something about Nash that reminded her of a half-finished garment. Beautiful in its potential but incomplete, waiting for the right hands to bring out its true nature. The northern trail proved even more challenging than Nash had warned. The landscape turned harsh and unforgiving, with rocky ground that punished both horses and cattle. Water became precious, rationed carefully between the animals and the men. Eleanor learned to cook with minimum water, creating meals from ingredients that seemed barely edible. During this difficult stretch, she began to notice changes in Nash. He still rode alone and spoke little, but sometimes she caught him watching her with an expression that seemed almost protective. When her horse threw a shoe and went lame, Nash appeared with a replacement mount without being asked. When a sudden storm threatened to scatter their supplies, he helped her secure the chuck wagon with the efficiency of someone who anticipated problems before they occurred. One evening, as Eleanor struggled to start a fire with damp wood, Nash materialized beside her again. This time, instead of simply fixing the problem and leaving, he crouched down and began showing her techniques for building fires in adverse conditions. "Dry bark from the inside of dead branches," he said quietly. "And you can use bacon grease to help wet wood catch." His hands moved with practiced grace, and Eleanor found herself studying them as closely as she once examined fine needlework. They were scarred from years of hard work but moved with surprising delicacy. "Where did you learn all this?" she asked. Nash's hands stilled for a moment. "You pick things up." "That's not an answer." He looked at her directly for the first time in weeks. "Sometimes, answers create more problems than questions." Eleanor sensed she was approaching the edge of territory Nash didn't want to explore, but her curiosity had always been stronger than her caution. "You know, back in Boston, I made dresses for ladies who never worked a day in their lives. They thought they knew hardship if their tea was served lukewarm. But out here, I've learned what real strength looks like." Nash fed another stick to the growing flame. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I recognize someone who's carrying more weight than shows on the surface. The way you help without wanting credit. The way you anticipate problems. The way you handle yourself like a man who's seen trouble." Nash stood abruptly. "You should be careful about reading things into people, Miss Whitmore. Sometimes what looks like strength is just necessity." He walked away, leaving Eleanor with the dancing flames and a dozen new questions. But she had seen something in his eyes during that brief conversation. A flicker of vulnerability quickly shuddered. Whatever Nash was running from, whatever had brought him to this hard life on the frontier, it had carved deep lines of caution into his character. As the cattle drive pushed deeper into the wilderness, Eleanor found herself caught between two transformations. She was changing from a sheltered city woman into someone who could thrive in the harsh beauty of the frontier. But she was also becoming someone who saw beneath surfaces, who recognized the hidden depths in a man who worked hard to remain invisible. The rim of the frontier still lay weeks ahead, but Eleanor was beginning to understand that some journeys changed not just where you were, but who you were, and some destinations were worth fighting for, even when the most difficult obstacles came not from the landscape, but from the people standing in your way. The Badlands tested every member of Morrison's outfit in ways they had never anticipated. Water holes that should have been reliable turned out to be dried mud cracks. The cattle grew restless and difficult to manage in the heat that seemed to radiate from the very rocks around them. Eleanor learned to stretch every drop of water, creating meals from ingredients that would have seemed impossible to transform into food just weeks earlier. It was during this harsh stretch that she began to understand Nash better. Not through words but through actions that spoke louder than any conversation. When her water barrel developed a slow leak, Nash appeared before dawn with tools and materials to repair it, working in silence while she prepared breakfast. When a group of the younger cowboys began making comments about her appearance after weeks on the trail, Nash's presence nearby seemed to discourage their crude observations without him saying a single word. Eleanor had grown up believing that protection came through proper channels, through fathers and brothers and eventual husbands who would shield ladies from the harsh realities of the world. But Nash's brand of protection was different. It was quiet, consistent, and asked for nothing in return. He never made her feel helpless or incapable, but somehow she always felt safer when he was near. The revelation came on a Tuesday that started like any other difficult day in the Badlands. Eleanor was preparing the noon meal when she heard Morrison calling for Nash with unusual urgency. She looked up to see a rider approaching in the distance, moving fast across the rocky terrain. The stranger who rode into their camp brought news that turned Eleanor's blood cold. The rustlers they had encountered earlier were not just random thieves but part of the notorious Kellerman gang, led by a man named Black Jack Kellerman, who had been terrorizing the territory for months. Worse, they had learned about Morrison's valuable herd and were reportedly tracking them through the Badlands. "How many men they got?" Morrison asked the messenger. "Near on 20, maybe more, well armed and mean as rattlesnakes. They've been hitting drives all season, and they don't leave witnesses." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. She had heard stories of what men like Kellerman did to women they encountered on the frontier. The other cowboys looked grim, checking their weapons with the automatic movements of men preparing for violence. Nash listened to the report with an expression that had gone completely cold. When the messenger finished speaking, Nash stepped forward. "I know Kellerman," he said quietly. "Know how he thinks, how he operates." Morrison's eyes sharpened. "You been holding out on us, Nash?" "Not holding out. Just didn't see the need to dig up old business. But if Kellerman's tracking us, old business becomes current problems." Eleanor watched Nash's face transform as he spoke. The careful neutrality she had grown accustomed to was replaced by something harder, more dangerous. This was a side of him she had sensed but never seen, and it both frightened and fascinated her. "What aren't you telling us?" Morrison pressed. Nash was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. 5 years ago, Kellerman killed my partner during a bank robbery in Abilene. I tracked him for 6 months before the law told me to let it go. Seems he's moved on to bigger prey since then." Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest. So Nash had been a lawman, which explained his skills with weapons and his ability to anticipate trouble. But it also explained the shadows in his eyes and his reluctance to talk about his past. "Why didn't you catch him?" young Tommy Wells asked innocently. Nash's smile was colder than winter wind. "Who says I didn't?" The implications of that statement hung in the air like gun smoke. Morrison studied Nash with new understanding. "If you got history with Kellerman, that makes you valuable. But it also makes you a target. You sure you want to stay with us for this fight?" Nash looked directly at Eleanor for the first time that day. "I'm not going anywhere." That evening, as the men planned their defense strategy, Eleanor found herself unable to concentrate on her usual tasks. The thought of violence coming to their small community on wheels filled her with dread, but something else troubled her more deeply. Nash's revelation had peeled back another layer of the mystery surrounding him, but it also made her realize how little she truly knew about the man who had become such a constant presence in her life. She was scrubbing pots when Nash approached the chuck wagon. Instead of his usual brief appearance, he lingered, seeming to struggle with something. "Miss Whitmore," he said finally. Eleanor, hearing her name from his lips, sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. "There's something you should understand about what's coming. Kellerman isn't just another outlaw. He's smart, he's ruthless, and he doesn't follow the usual rules." Eleanor set down her scrub brush. "What are you trying to tell me?" "I'm trying to tell you that if things go bad, you should know there are choices. Sometimes running is smarter than fighting." "Are you suggesting I abandon these men?" "I'm suggesting you stay alive." Eleanor studied his face in the flickering firelight. "What about you? Are you planning to run?" Nash shook his head. "I can't run from Kellerman anymore. Tried that for 5 years, and it didn't work. Some things follow you no matter how far you travel." "Then I'm not running either." "Eleanor, this isn't your fight." Neither was learning to cook over an open fire, or sleep on the ground, or deal with stubborn cattle. "But I learned those things because they needed learning. If these men are facing danger, then it's my fight too." Nash stared at her for a long moment. "You know, when I first saw you in Boston, I thought you were just another city woman playing at adventure. I was wrong about a lot of things. You saw me in Boston?" Eleanor's heart skipped. "Where?" Nash looked uncomfortable. "Outside your dress shop. The day before the cattle drive started. Morrison sent me to check on supplies, and I saw you through the window, working on some kind of fancy dress. You looked so focused, so skilled. I remember thinking you had no business on a cattle trail." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks. "You were watching me? Just for a moment. Long enough to see that you cared about your work the way most people care about family. Takes a special person to put that much of themselves into what they do." Something had shifted between them during this conversation, though Eleanor couldn't quite name what it was. Nash had always been careful to maintain distance, but now he seemed to be deliberately closing the gap. "Nash," she said softly. "What was your partner's name? The one Kellerman killed?" "Samuel Morrison. Sam. He was Jake's younger brother." Eleanor's breath caught. "Morrison's brother? Does Jake know you're the one who went after Kellerman?" "Jake knows. Why do you think he hired me? Wasn't for my charming personality. So you've been riding with this outfit because Jake gave me a chance to rebuild something I thought was gone forever. And because Sam deserved better than what he got." Eleanor understood now why Nash carried himself like a man with a mission. He wasn't just a cowboy working for wages. He was carrying the weight of justice, delayed, and friendship betrayed. No wonder he held himself apart from the others. "How did you form new connections when you were still tending the wounds of old ones?" The attack came 3 days later, just as the sun was setting behind the jagged rocks of the Badlands. Eleanor was banking the fire for the night when she heard the first gunshot echoing off the canyon walls. Within seconds, the peaceful evening erupted into chaos. Nash's voice cut through the confusion. "Eleanor, get under the chuck wagon and stay there." But Eleanor had no intention of hiding while the men fought for their lives. She grabbed the rifle Morrison had insisted she learn to use and found a position behind the wagon where she could see the approaching riders. Kellerman's gang came fast and hard, using the rocky terrain to their advantage. They attacked from 3 directions at once, trying to scatter the cattle and isolate the defenders. Eleanor could see Nash moving through the confusion like a man possessed, his gun firing with deadly accuracy while he shouted instructions to the other cowboys. The battle lasted less than an hour, but it felt like days. When the shooting finally stopped, 3 of Kellerman's men lay dead, and the rest had retreated into the rocks. But the victory came at a cost. 2 of Morrison's cowboys were wounded, and several cattle had been lost in the panic. Nash appeared at Eleanor's side as she was tending to young Tommy's bullet graze. His shirt was torn, and blood seeped from a cut on his cheek, but his eyes held a satisfaction she had never seen before. "They'll be back," he said grimly. "But not tonight. Kellerman likes to plan his next move when he's been hurt." Eleanor looked up from her bandaging. "How badly are we outnumbered?" "Bad enough. But we hurt them today, and that counts for something." Over the next week, Kellerman's gang played a deadly game of cat and mouse with the cattle drive. They attacked supply lines, scattered cattle during the night, and generally made life miserable without committing to another full assault. The constant tension wore on everyone's nerves, but it seemed to energize Nash in a way that surprised Eleanor. She began to see glimpses of the man he had been before tragedy reshaped him. His natural leadership abilities emerged as he coordinated the defense efforts. His knowledge of outlaw tactics proved invaluable in predicting Kellerman's next moves, and his easy competence with weapons reminded everyone that some men were simply born to fight for what was right. But the change that surprised Eleanor most was how Nash began to open up to her during the brief, quiet moments between attacks. As if the prospect of violence had burned away his careful reservations, he started sharing pieces of his past that helped her understand the man behind the mystery. "Sam and I grew up together in Kansas," he told her one evening as they waited for his watch to begin. "His family took me in when my folks died of fever. Jake was already working cattle drives by then, but Sam wanted to be a lawman. Said the frontier needed men willing to stand between honest folks and the wolves that preyed on them." "And you agreed with him?" "I believed in him. Sam had this way of making you believe that one person could actually make a difference. That justice wasn't just a pretty word people used to feel better about themselves. Eleanor could hear the pain in Nash's voice, the wound that had never properly healed. What happened the day Kellerman killed him? Nash stared into the fire for a long moment. We were tracking a gang that had been hitting banks across 3 territories. Got word they were planning to rob the Abilene Bank on a Wednesday morning. Sam wanted to set up an ambush, catch them in the act. I argued for waiting for backup, but Sam said waiting meant more innocent people might get hurt. So you went in with just the 2 of you? Yeah, and it worked, mostly. We stopped the robbery, arrested 2 of the gang members. But Kellerman got away. And Sam went after him alone while I was securing the prisoners. By the time I followed, it was too late. Found Sam in an alley behind the bank, shot in the back. Eleanor felt her heart break a little for the young man Nash had been. Full of idealism and faith in justice. I'm sorry. The worst part wasn't losing Sam, though that nearly killed me. The worst part was what happened after. The town council decided that chasing Kellerman was too dangerous. Too expensive. They wanted to call it a closed case and move on. Said one dead lawman was enough. But you didn't agree. Nash's smile held no warmth. I handed in my badge that same day, and went after Kellerman on my own. Took me 6 months to track him down, and when I did, he stopped speaking, but Eleanor could fill in the blanks. What did you do? What needed doing? Left him for the law to find. Though I wasn't particular about what condition he was in when they found him. Cantry. Eleanor understood now why Nash had seemed so haunted. So careful about forming connections. He had learned that justice was sometimes a luxury honest people couldn't afford, and that protecting the people you cared about might require choices that left marks on your soul. So when you saw Kellerman's name again, I knew this was my chance to finish what Sam and I started. Only this time, I wasn't wearing a badge, and I wasn't answering to anyone but myself. The admission hung between them like a bridge Eleanor wasn't sure she was ready to cross. Nash wasn't just a cowboy with a mysterious past. He was a man who had deliberately chosen a path that might lead to violence and death. The question was whether she was prepared to care about someone who lived so close to the edge of darkness. The answer came to her during Kellerman's final assault. The attack happened at dawn, when the light was uncertain and the cattle were restless from another sleepless night. This time, Kellerman brought his full force, determined to overwhelm Morrison's defenses through sheer numbers and firepower. Eleanor found herself crouched behind the chuck wagon again, but this time she was actively participating in the fight, reloading rifles for the men and watching for threats they might miss. The battle was fiercer than before, with bullets flying from every direction and the sound of gunfire echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. She was passing ammunition to Morrison when she saw Nash break cover and charge toward a group of outlaws who had gotten too close to the cattle. It was an incredibly brave and incredibly foolish move that left him exposed to crossfire from multiple directions. Without thinking, Eleanor grabbed a rifle and began firing at the outlaws, threatening Nash's position. Her shots weren't particularly accurate, but they were enough to make Kellerman's men take cover and give Nash the seconds he needed to reach safety. When the smoke finally cleared, Kellerman himself lay dead among the rocks, and his surviving gang members were in full retreat. The threat that had haunted the cattle drive was finally over, but Eleanor barely noticed. All her attention was focused on Nash, who sat leaning against a boulder with blood soaking his shirt and a pale, shaky look that frightened her more than all of Kellerman's guns. "You hit?" she asked, dropping to her knees beside him. "Just a scratch," he said, but his voice was weak. Eleanor pushed his hands away from the wound and examined it herself. The bullet had grazed his ribs, deep enough to bleed freely but not deep enough to be immediately dangerous. She tore strips from her petticoat and began bandaging the injury with the same focused attention she once gave to delicate embroidery. "You're going to be fine," she said, as much to convince herself as him. "Eleanor," Nash caught her hand as she worked. "Thank you for not getting yourself killed." Nash smiled. And for the first time since she had known him, it reached his eyes. "You know, I've been thinking about what comes next. After we reach Colorado." Eleanor's hands stilled. "What about it?" "Morrison's offered me a permanent position running security for his ranch. Good pay, steady work, chance to put down roots somewhere. That sounds like a good opportunity. It is. Question is whether I'd be putting those roots down alone. Eleanor looked up from the bandage to find Nash watching her with an expression that made her pulse quicken. What are you asking me? I'm asking if a former dressmaker turned trail cook might be interested in trying a new adventure. One that doesn't involve quite so much shooting. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, though she couldn't say whether they came from relief, joy, or the simple, overwhelming nature of everything that had happened. I think that former dressmaker might be very interested indeed. Nash reached up and touched her cheek gently. Good, because I've got plans for our life together, and most of them involve you being around to see them through. As Eleanor leaned down to kiss him, tasting dust and hope and the promise of a future she had never dared to imagine, she realized that some journeys took you exactly where you needed to be, even when the destination was nothing like what you had originally planned. The rim of the frontier was still days away, but she was beginning to understand that home wasn't a place you reached. It was something you built with the right person. One day at a time, the landscape began to change as they pushed deeper into Colorado territory. The harsh Badlands gave way to rolling hills covered in golden grass that danced in the wind like silk fabric. Eleanor found herself breathing easier, not just from the cleaner air but from the knowledge that the worst of their journey was behind them. Kellerman was dead, his gang scattered to the winds, and the cattle drive was finally approaching its destination. But with safety came new challenges Eleanor hadn't anticipated. Nash's wound healed cleanly, though he favored his left side for several days after the final battle. More importantly, the violence seemed to have changed him in ways that went beyond the physical. The careful distance he had maintained throughout most of the journey was gone, replaced by an openness that sometimes caught Eleanor off guard. He began riding closer to the chuck wagon, often dismounting to walk beside her during the easier stretches of trail. Their conversations, once brief and practical, stretched into discussions about everything from the changing landscape to their hopes for the future. Nash had a way of listening that made Eleanor feel like her thoughts mattered, like her dreams were worth pursuing rather than merely surviving. Tell me about the dresses you used to make, he said one afternoon, as they watched the cattle graze in a meadow dotted with wildflowers. Eleanor smiled, remembering. They were mostly for wealthy ladies who wanted to look fashionable at social events. Ball gowns, dinner dresses, wedding dresses. I specialized in intricate beadwork and embroidery. Must have been satisfying work. It was, in its way. There's something deeply peaceful about creating beauty from nothing but thread and fabric. But it was also limiting. The ladies I worked for had very specific ideas about what was appropriate, what was proper. Everything had to fit into narrow definitions of acceptable. Nash nodded thoughtfully. Sounds like the kind of life where you could be very skilled but never really yourself. Eleanor looked at him in surprise. That's exactly right. How did you know? Because I lived the same way for years. Being a lawman meant following rules, staying within boundaries, always doing what was expected rather than what felt right. After Sam died, I realized I'd been living someone else's idea of what my life should look like. And now? Nash gestured at the vast landscape around them. Now I'm figuring out what my life looks like when I'm the one making the choices. As they drew closer to their destination, Eleanor found herself torn between excitement and unexpected sadness. The cattle drive had been the most challenging experience of her life, but it had also been transformative in ways she was still discovering. She had learned that she was capable of far more than she had ever imagined. That strength came in forms she had never recognized, and that sometimes the best things in life were found in the places you least expected to look. Morrison's ranch, when it finally came into view, was nothing like the elegant estates Eleanor had known in Boston. It was a working operation, built for function rather than beauty, with sturdy buildings that could withstand the harsh winters and fierce storms of the Colorado frontier. But there was something deeply appealing about its honest simplicity, the way every structure served a clear purpose in the greater whole. Morrison gathered the crew for the final time as they prepared to drive the cattle into their new pastures. Boys, we've covered near on 800 miles together, and every one of you has my gratitude and respect. Those who want permanent work here at the ranch, see me tomorrow morning. Those who are moving on, you'll always have a place at my table, and my recommendation, wherever you go. That evening, as the men celebrated the successful completion of the drive, Eleanor found herself walking alone toward a hill that overlooked the ranch. The sunset painted the sky in shades of pink and gold that reminded her of the finest silks she had ever worked with, but no human hands could have created something so perfect. She was surprised when Nash appeared beside her, moving with the quiet grace she had come to associate with him. "Beautiful view," he said. "It is. I keep thinking about how different this is from anything I've ever known. A month ago, I couldn't have imagined wanting to stay in a place like this, and now?" Eleanor turned to look at him directly. "Now, I can't imagine wanting to leave." Nash smiled. "That's good. Because I meant what I said back in the Badlands. About building a future together. Nash, there's something we should discuss. I'm not the same woman who left Boston. This journey has changed me in ways I'm still understanding. I don't know if I can go back to being someone who fits into neat, proper categories." Nash stepped closer. "Eleanor, the woman who left Boston was impressive, but the woman standing here now is extraordinary. You've proven you can handle anything life throws at you. Why would I want you to change back?" Eleanor felt something release in her chest, a tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. "I was worried you might expect me to become a traditional ranch wife. Someone who stayed in the kitchen and left the real work to the men." Nash laughed, a sound that was both warm and slightly incredulous. "Have you met you? You think I want to waste all that strength and intelligence on just keeping house?" "Eleanor, I've been thinking we could start something new here." Morrison mentioned he's been wanting to expand into supplying other ranches and cattle drives. "Someone with your organizational skills and my knowledge of trail work could build a real business." Eleanor's pulse quickened. "What kind of business?" "Outfitting. Supplies, guidance, security for people heading west. There are hundreds of families coming through this territory every year, and most of them have no idea what they're facing. We could help them the way Cookie helped you, the way Morrison's outfit protected all of us." The idea sparked something in Eleanor's imagination. She could see it clearly. An operation that combined practical necessities with the human touch that made the difference between surviving and thriving on the frontier. "We could provide more than just supplies," she said, excitement building in her voice. "Proper training, advice about routes and weather, even basic medical supplies and knowledge. There are so many ways to help people succeed instead of just hoping they don't fail." Nash grinned. "See? I knew you'd understand. We could be partners in every sense of the word." Eleanor studied his face in the fading light. "Partners. I like the sound of that. But Nash, there's something else we need to discuss." "What's that?" Eleanor took a deep breath. "In Boston, I was engaged once. To a man my father chose for me. He was appropriate, respectable, financially secure, everything a young lady was supposed to want." Nash's expression grew serious. "What happened?" "I realized that appropriate and respectable weren't the same thing as compatible. He wanted a wife who would enhance his social position and manage his household efficiently. He wasn't particularly interested in my thoughts, or my dreams, or my feelings. The engagement ended when my father's business failed, but honestly, I was relieved." Nash nodded slowly. "You're telling me this? Because?" "Because I need to know that what we're talking about is real partnership, not just you being kind to a woman who helped you through a difficult time." Nash reached out and took her hands in his. "Eleanor, I've been alone for 5 years. Alone by choice, because I didn't trust myself to care about anyone else the way I cared about Sam. But somewhere along this trail, you made me believe that maybe isolation wasn't the same thing as safety." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "Nash, let me finish. You're the strongest person I've ever met, man or woman. You've proven you can handle anything, and you've never once asked anyone else to fight your battles for you. Why would I want to change that? I want to build something with you, not for you." Eleanor leaned forward and kissed him softly. "Then yes. Partners in every sense of the word." The wedding took place a month later, on a crisp October morning when the aspens were dressed in gold and the air carried the promise of winter. Eleanor wore a dress she had sewn herself from blue wool Morrison had brought from town. simple but elegant in the way that only perfect craftsmanship could achieve. Nash wore his best shirt and a black suit coat that Eleanor had altered to fit his broader shoulders. Jake Morrison performed the ceremony himself, having been ordained as a minister years earlier for exactly such occasions. The entire ranch crew served as witnesses, along with several neighboring families who had already heard about the remarkable woman who had completed a cattle drive and captured the heart of the most solitary man in Colorado. Do you, Nash Williams, take Eleanor to be your wife, to stand beside her through whatever challenges and adventures life may bring? I do. And do you, Eleanor Whitmore? Take Nash to be your husband, to build a future together based on mutual respect, shared dreams, and equal partnership? I do. As Nash slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, Eleanor thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The woman who had packed her life into a single satchel in Boston would barely recognize the person she had become. That woman had been skilled and determined, but she had also been limited by other people's definitions of what was possible. The woman standing in this simple ceremony had learned that possibilities expanded when you were willing to work for them, that strength came in countless forms, and that sometimes the best destination was the one you never could have imagined when you started the journey. The celebration continued well into the evening, with music provided by cowboys who proved surprisingly talented with fiddles and harmonicas. Eleanor found herself dancing with Nash under a canopy of stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. And for the first time in her adult life, she felt completely, perfectly where she belonged. Any regrets about leaving Boston? Nash asked as they swayed to a particularly gentle tune. Eleanor looked around at the faces of their friends, lit by firelight and filled with genuine happiness for their good fortune. She thought about the business they were planning, the life they were building, the endless possibilities that stretched ahead of them. None whatsoever, she said. Though I do think we should plan a trip back east someday. I'd like to show my former customers what a real adventure looks like. 7. Nash laughed. Deal. But I have a feeling most of them wouldn't believe their eyes. As the evening wound down and the guests began drifting toward their homes, Eleanor and Nash found themselves alone by the dying fire. The ranch was quiet, except for the distant sound of cattle settling for the night and the soft whisper of wind through the grass. So what happens now? Eleanor asked. Now we build something that's never existed before. A business, a marriage, a life that's exactly what we want it to be. Eleanor smiled and leaned against Nash's shoulder. I like the sound of that. Though I should probably warn you, I have some very specific ideas about how things should be organized. I'm counting on it. Someone's got to keep me from making a complete mess of the paperwork. 6 months later, Williams & Associates Frontier Outfitters was serving its 15th client family, providing everything from basic supplies to comprehensive trail guidance for people heading west. Eleanor had proven as gifted at business management as she had been at needlework, organizing their operations with the same attention to detail that had once created perfect buttonholes and invisible seams. Nash handled the practical aspects of trail work, teaching men how to handle cattle and horses, while Eleanor worked with the women, sharing the skills that had kept Morrison's outfit fed and healthy throughout their journey. Together, they had created something that was both profitable and genuinely helpful, a business that made the frontier a little less dangerous for ordinary families seeking extraordinary dreams. On a warm spring evening, as Eleanor sat on the porch of their small house reviewing the accounts for their growing business, Nash returned from a supply run to town with an unusual expression on his face. What's wrong? Eleanor asked, setting down her ledger. Nothing's wrong, but I got some interesting news in town. Seems there's a reporter from back east who's been asking questions about the woman who completed a cattle drive and started a frontier business. Wants to write a story about you for some ladies' magazine. Eleanor frowned. What kind of story? The kind that makes you sound like some sort of curiosity. The refined lady who tamed the Wild West, or some such nonsense. Eleanor shook her head. I didn't tame anything. I just learned how to live here. Nash grinned and settled beside her on the porch swing they had built together. That's exactly what I told him. Suggested if he wanted to write about remarkable women, he should focus on how you built a business that actually helps people, instead of making it sound like you were playing dress-up in someone else's life. Eleanor smiled and returned to her ledger. Good. I'd hate for people to get the wrong impression about what's possible out here. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in colors that still reminded Eleanor of the finest fabrics she had ever seen, she reflected on how completely her definition of success had changed. Once, she had measured achievement in perfect stitches and satisfied customers, in social approval and financial security. Now success meant something entirely different. It meant waking up beside a man who valued her opinions as much as her cooking. It meant running a business that made a real difference in people's lives. It meant belonging to a community that appreciated her contributions without trying to limit them to predefined roles. Most importantly, it meant understanding that reaching the rim of the frontier wasn't about arriving at a specific geographical location. It was about discovering how far you could stretch beyond the boundaries others had drawn for your life, and finding that the view from that expanded perspective was more beautiful than anything you had ever imagined. Eleanor closed her ledger and leaned against Nash's shoulder, listening to the familiar sounds of their ranch settling into evening quiet. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack, and the sound no longer seemed lonely or threatening. Instead, it sounded like a celebration of the wild, wide freedom that had become the foundation of everything she held dear. The journey that had begun in a desperate flight from failure had become something far greater than she had ever dared to hope. It had become home, partnership, and proof that sometimes the best destinations were the ones you built yourself. One choice at a time, in the company of someone brave enough to dream as big as you did. And if that wasn't worth celebrating, Eleanor thought as she smiled up at the stars, then nothing was.